Hello. Welcome. Thanks for having us. My name is Blake Ewing. I'm the mayor's chief of staff. You might be wondering why someone with that title is here. It's because this is my boss's kind of primary capital improvement objective of his time as both a city councilor and as the mayor. And it's essentially my day-to-day job to make sure that what happens between now and September and even thereafter is a success. So I am the least specifically knowledgeable person about what we're doing, but I might be the person that knows a little bit about the most things about what we're doing. So I get to work with everybody from our tourism folks who are working on the programming and amenities that happen, to river parks, who's dealing with infrastructure, to city staff who's dealing with the capital investment and the addition of the physical amenities like parking and bathrooms and that kind of stuff, to other city staff who are dealing with our water quality program and that kind of thing. So there are 100 different things happening, as you might imagine, to bring an amenity of this size and scale to life here in Tulsa. And that just requires lots of work and a lot of different people all collaborating and working together to make it happen. I get the honor of being kind of the one involved in all of those conversations to some degree. And we are surrounded by an incredible team of experts, I think, across the board. There's folks also in the back of the room who are here. It's really been a group effort, and it's been a fun thing to be a part of. Before I was the mayor's chief of staff, I was a city councilor who represented District 4, which included about 3 miles of Zink Lake, and was on the city council when the vision program that funded this project was passed by voters. So I've had quite the history with it myself, and I'm excited to see things come to fruition, open to the public Labor Day of this year. So if you've been by in the last couple of days, you've seen that the water has been impounded. For me, that word always meant like someone's car got taken. In this sense, it means that the dam the gates are up and that the water is filling up the lake. I see questions about, is it a lake or is it a river? And just to clarify that, and if you feel like I'm talking down, please don't. I've seen enough internet comments to know that these things merit conversation. Most of our lakes are rivers that somebody put a dam on and it turned it into a lake. So Keystone Lake was just the Arkansas River before a dam was built that turned it into the lake. This is a much smaller lake downstream from Keystone with a much smaller dam, but by raising the gates, create a lake, meaning a body of water that just kind of stays. In 2000 let's go all the way back. In the early 1980s, the city of Tulsa decided to put low water dams in and to do a project there. So all the infrastructure that you have seen over the years came from that program during the Jim Inhofe administration when I was 2 years old. That project didn't go great over the course of time. Those dam gates did not work as they were supposed to after some time or lack of maintenance. And so what you've seen for the last several years, and I mean decades, has been a faulty dam at Zink Lake. It was always called Zink Lake going back to that time, but it didn't work like it was supposed to. So in the early 2000s, elected people, the city government started having questions, along with the county really, and INCOG, our Indian Nations Council of Government, about what we do, how do we plan for this amenity moving forward. In 2004, there was a vision plan where they evaluated all of this. You started seeing studies of what could we do to solve the problem that is this previous Zink Lake. In 2005, the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan was created. You can go find all of these documents if you're the type of person who likes to do that. They're all public documents and searchable. In 2010, a preliminary project management plan was created. All of those things led up to Vision Tulsa. That's our city's capital improvement program. And in Vision Tulsa, after 2 years of public meetings about how it would work, how much it would cost, how to build it, where to build it, how many dams could it be, questions about the things that we're going to talk about tonight. about impacts on fish and wildlife, about water quality, about all of those things. Those happened in a series of what would be a gazillion hours of public discussion with experts about how to do this project the right way. That led to this issue going on the ballot in 2016 in the Vision Tulsa program. And that was the largest ballot item on the Vision program, maybe second largest, but I think the largest. And that program passed overwhelmingly by one of the largest margins of success in in the city's history. That took, I'll say there was a couple of things before. You guys have probably heard about the Channels project, or there was another river initiative that had happened and failed somewhere before. So there were two failed capital improvement programs somewhere in the 2000 aughts or before. Those were failed projects. This was the one that was successful. And I think part of what we learned from the failures the first time was that not enough public engagement, not enough community discussion leading up to those things. And so when my current boss, your current mayor, leading this effort as the chair of this on the city council, felt like this needed to be the most comprehensive public engagement process in the city's history for a capital program. And it was. And if you don't believe me, all of those meetings are available to go find online, and it's mind-numbing, but if you're the type, it's there for the viewing. After that vote passed, staff got to work, the paid consultants, hired contract consultants got to work designing the dam and leading us to today, which is the design and the build and the installation of the dam. That capital program also funded the new pedestrian bridge, a controversial item in its own right. Some folks loved the train bridge that had been converted that was there before. The engineering report on that was that the piers that were holding it up were basically had turned to mush, and it was no longer a safe situation. Just the work to make that dam bridge functional again was going to cost essentially the same amount of building a larger bridge. So that the discussion resulted in a wider multi-use bridge that complemented the gathering place is what was ultimately decided on with those funds. So two things happened, dam and the dam bridge. And so here you have it. That just now at the spot that they're starting to do the testing and tuning. This also has an accompanying flume that goes with it. What that means is it's a recreational kind of accessory to the dam on the east bank close to the gathering place. The flume has a series of, what do you call them? Basins? We call them basins? I'm going to call them basins that you're able to navigate in a kayak, for example. It funnels the water from Zink Lake through a channel, causing it to pick up speed, and allows people to recreate down what is about a 1/4 mile long series of basins for kayaking and other types of recreational activities. If you want to see how that looks now, the Confluence River in Colorado has a similar setup, and you can just YouTube Confluence River flume and see for yourself kind of how that's functioning today. We will be tuning and working on that through the course of the summer to make sure that it's a safe amenity for people to use when the lake opens. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I do have a question about the economic development component for this. Can you just describe a little bit how this will boost the economic well-being of Tulsans, all Tulsans?
Sure. Through that series of 2 years worth of meetings where we investigated this project, that was one of the elements. And as if you've traveled much, you've seen all over the country where there are urban recreational waterways, there's almost always accompanying adjacent shoreline development. People want to gather around water. That's not a new phenomenon. That goes back to the beginning of man. And we see that in cities where they focus attention on their waterways, you always see activity and amenities adjacent. So, I'm heading to Austin tomorrow. And it's I think a great example, if you've been to Austin, of what happens when you have an urban waterway that goes right through the middle of the city. And every time I've been to Austin, I've seen people kayaking and paddle boating and all of the things right there in the middle of the city. I think we hope the same kind of thing happens here. I will say that from a development standpoint, we've been pretty careful to lay a foundation that doesn't invite massive high-intensity development throughout the entire river corridor. And the first preservation action that was taken in our community was the establishment of the river park system. So as you know, river parks is tens of miles of green space on both sides of the river throughout all through Tulsa, largely designed to preserve that space as a recreational asset, not a development site. A few years back, we did a planning exercise while I was still on the council that created the first of the city's design districts. What's called, we affectionately call it the RDO, the River Design Overlay, defined design guidelines within the river corridor. We didn't want trash cans abutting the river. We didn't want drive-throughs. We didn't want pole signs up in the air. We didn't want too much surface parking. There were all these things that would otherwise be allowable kind of all over the rest of town that we said in the river corridor, no. If you're going to do development here, it needs to look a certain way. It needs to accentuate the river and not detract from it. It needs to be mindful of the surroundings of the park system. So that was kind of step one in creating a bit of a development strategy that said, here are the really 4 places that we anticipate there being any kind of intensity with the development project. And those places are the Cyrus Avery site at Crybaby Hill, if you're familiar, on the far kind of north end next to 244. The West Bank, where the concrete plant is next to River West Festival Park, and the city's current city yard is all on the waterfront on the west side. 71st and Riverside was one that kind of famously had a controversial proposal for an REI development once upon a time. And then I think somewhere south that I'm not remembering exact intersection, but I'm thinking like 106th and Riverside, somewhere that far down. Other than that, the expectation is that it remains a park or that it remains whatever's currently on the waterfront, Turkey Mountain, and there's some places that are Muskogee Nation Casino and things like that. But this is not a plan to fill up this river with water and then develop a bunch of high rises or whatever all along the river. We still want it to be a recreational amenity.
Thank you for that. Talk to us a little bit about first contaminant of concern in the river, just basic.
Good evening. My name is Eric Lee, Director of Water and Sewer for the City of Tulsa. For a lot of us, we know if you're recreating in any water source or water body, whether it's in Oklahoma or any other state, there's things that happen, right? Nature happens. You have cities that they have to process wastewater. They clean it, they discharge it. You have industry. You have, waterfowl. You have a number of things that could put pollutants or contaminants into water sources. And so one of the things that we were looking at, we showed this on the dashboard, if you look at our watershed that includes the Arkansas River, that starts up in Colorado. So if you're thinking Colorado Springs touches it, it comes through Kansas, it goes through Wichita, touches it. And so by the time it gets to us, whether it's cattle farms or hog farms or chicken houses or whatever it happens to be, there's livestock, so that happens. And so livestock has what? They have bacteria in what their waste is. We have bacteria in cities. We use wastewater systems. There's bacteria in what we flush down the drain. I know it's not a popular topic, but that happens. And so bacteria is one thing. It's usually the most popular thing to show up on water bodies for impairment. And so one of the things that the Arkansas River is impaired for is bacteria. And so that's usually the upper level of kind of the focus of attention on contaminants. But we also have other things that happen. So if you can imagine in a metropolitan area, when it rains, that water hits the pavement and if you see this when you're driving through city streets, there's spots of oil, there's other things that come from your cars. It could be the trash that was picked up and compacted and that juice comes out the back of the trash truck. There's lots of things that can happen. We see and manage both a stormwater and a wastewater system, and you wouldn't believe the things that people decide they want to put down into the wastewater or the stormwater system. So those things travel down, and those can become contaminants as well. You also have industry, and so one of the things I know that nationally that people are focused on right now are PFAS. So the concern is, well, PFAS, how do those get into our water system? And I don't know how many people here are wearing makeup or have worn sunscreen or used Teflon pans. And so as we wash those things away, they go through our wastewater system. Those become contaminants. And so those, along with industrial discharges, those things happen. We try to protect the water, but those things still get in there. So the other contaminant that we're impaired for in the Arkansas River is cadmium. So cadmium is used in a lot of electroplating. And one of the reasons that we picked up on that is because of that impairment. And so we're testing for that. So if you take our bacteria, we're testing for that twice a week. If you take cadmium, we're testing that once a month. So far on the results for cadmium, we haven't seen a hit. It's been below detectable limits. We are seeing bacteria. E. coli is one of the 2 bacteria that the state asked us to test for. And so far those numbers, you can see on the screen behind me, those numbers look pretty good. But the numbers that are in the red, you'll see is for enterococci. And so that's another bacteria test. Usually that's used in coastal areas where coastal tests when you have salt water. You don't pick up the E. coli as well, and so you test for enterococci. The problem though with enterococci is sometimes you can have false positive. It's not always consistent as E. coli. And so one of the things we're talking about is that's something that we continue to test for. And so I know that some agencies have moved away from that test, whether it's in Oklahoma or Texas and others, and I think Shannon will talk to this, but we're looking at it. We want to monitor it. We want to make it accessible so that people can understand what we're testing for. So that's on there as well. But one of the things, and Blake mentioned this previously, this is continuously going to be evolving. And so I think we had a question when we were at the gathering place on if we're going to test for lead or other heavy metals. And so one of the things we want to do is be very responsive to what we're hearing. And so if that needs to be something that we test for, then we'll go out and test for it and see if that's something that we're getting hits on. Is that something we need to be aware of? I spent some time with the Department of Environmental Quality on Friday talking about this endeavor. They're excited about what we're doing, being kind of the first in the state to monitor for contaminants. And so I think our goal along this whole journey is how can we continually get better so that citizens across both the Tulsa metro area, Northeast Oklahoma, and the state can see what we're doing and show how important water conservation is, not just in Northeast Oklahoma, but across the state. So one of the big questions that has come up in a couple of meetings that we were in was the concern about hydrocarbons in the water. And so one of the tests that tests for a number of hydrocarbons is called a TPH test, so total petroleum hydrocarbons. And so far we've tested for that once, and we've had below detectable limits. There's 3 components of that. I think if you show the results, we were all below detectable limits on the hydrocarbons. We want to continue to do that. I know that's a concern, and so we'll continue to monitor that. And you don't see it now, but we're just starting to get data in. And what we want to do is create trends, and so that people can see those trends. Do those happen when we have high releases from Keystone, low releases? Does it depend on temperature, other items? So the dashboard that you're seeing now will probably not be the same dashboard that you see in a year from now. So we want to make sure that as we gather that data, we're putting it in a format that's easily digestible by the viewing audience. So as we put that out there, we're trying to do things like green, yellow, and red, and put those in gauges so that when if and when we do have a total petroleum hydrocarbon above a detectable limit, that we can show that and bring that to people's attention. Through all of the responses, I don't know that we've identified all the responses yet on how we're going to respond if we see, it get into the yellow or get into a red on a certain parameter. One of the things we're going to have to do is use those parameters, which you're seeing behind me that we're testing for. We're going to have to look at those. And so just so everyone knows this, whenever we test for bacteria, those results take 24 to 36 hours to come back. So it's not immediate. And so what we need is kind of some of those immediate testing results. So turbidity is a great example. You can get results pretty quickly on turbidity. Now, if we're seeing turbidity kind of that parameter change and adjust with E. coli, maybe we can use that more as real-time monitoring. And then what we can do is based on that, do we need to create different communication pieces to let the public know turbidity's high. We should be cautious that maybe E. coli is high. bacteria is high. So we want to do that. And then, obviously we want to say, well, what is the next step? And I don't know that we're at that point yet where we've identified all those next steps to operationally respond to one of those parameters being high. Yeah.
So one of the things that we're doing in this next phase between now and the opening is developing the operational plan. And that's in partnership with the River Parks Authority, who will be the managing organization of this amenity. So I know that it's frustrating that it isn't all done, but there are things that couldn't be done until we could impound water. And one of those things, like we can't really have reliable testing protocols, frankly, until the water could be impounded. Testing a cesspool of water that's sitting in an otherwise dry lake doesn't provide you reliable results. Now that we're able to impound water, you can start putting a data set together based on conditions that are much more like what we're going to see moving forward. So there are people like, why aren't you testing already? Well, there wasn't necessarily a thing to test, and I kind of likened it to like you would not rely on crash test data based on a car that didn't have wheels. We had to build the dam so that we can then go to the next step that's a reliable testing practice. And the next 6 months are going to be spent with River Parks developing all of the protocols that Eric just talked about. When do we alert people? When do we change the signs in the parks? When do we keep people out of the water? All of those things will be defined well before we get open, but that's our next step.
So when a lot of people think about rivers, and we have a picture in our mind, right? For some people, it's what they're most familiar with, and it might be if you grew up in the mountains, your idea of what a river is supposed to look like is going to be different than if you grew up in the panhandle of Oklahoma, where your river is mostly dry. So rivers are a reflection of their watershed. And a prairie braided stream recognizes that the river conveys a different amount of water at different times, right? And so, the function of a river really is to move both water and sediment within its banks. And given the fact that the runoff and how often it rains in the Arkansas River Basin changes throughout the seasons and throughout years, that river has developed over time to process and move that sediment and that water through time. And it's natural for it to have a system of channels that move and bend back and forth as they process and move that water, and then to create point bars or sediment deposits when there's less water moving through the system. And that's a natural condition for that river based on the type of based on the slope of the river and the type of sediment that it washes through. Other rivers throughout the state look different. The Mountain Fork River in southeast Oklahoma has a very different morphology. We're one of the most diverse states in the nation in terms of the type of ecoregions that we have. There's only one state that has more than Oklahoma, and people don't always appreciate that or understand that. That means that we have many different types of rivers, and I am really appreciative of the folks who do recognize that there is beauty in a prairie braided stream, in a river that doesn't just have water from bank to bank, and appreciates that those point bars and those morphological parts of the river have a function for the wildlife and the part of the ecosystem that relies on it. There are, the Arkansas River is a river that has it drains. We've already talked about the fact that it drains all the way from Colorado, goes through multiple large reservoirs, including Keystone, that's right upstream of a large urban area. And so it's not the same prairie braided stream that it once was, and hasn't been for a long time because of the dam that was built at Keystone that changes the frequency of water and therefore sediment that moves through the system. But there are features in the river, even with Zink Lake being impounded above and below zinc, that are indicative of a prairie stream. And we can, I think as conservationists, we can work to protect and also help other people come to value those systems and better understand how those are just as important as water from bank to bank. So obviously the dam has impacts to water quality. It has impacts to the type of wildlife and terrestrial and aquatic vegetation that can exist there. And just some of these are could be viewed as benefits. Some of them could be challenges to address. The dam is going to slow water down and allow some contaminants to settle out above the Zink Lake Dam that then will have benefits to water quality downstream at times. The dam may also pool water and create deeper water. Typically in the summertime is cooler water, and cooler water can hold more oxygen. But again, the dam also, by trapping those contaminants, could cause challenges with oxygen levels above the dam. So it's creating a different type of habitat. And one of the things that we recognize in aquatic systems is a stream or a river that just has one type of habitat, that's just the same depth and the same swiftness and the same type of substrate, that doesn't serve and provide as many ecological niches as a river that has variable types of habitat. So creating a small lake will provide new types of ecosystem functions for some aquatic and terrestrial plants and animals that wouldn't have been there otherwise. And I think the opportunity that's created by having that impoundment of water is an opportunity for people to come to appreciate some of those other parts of the ecosystem. When you have natural areas, whether they're in urban centers or in rural areas, it brings new types of wildlife. And I think hopefully when people are around wildlife, that gives them opportunities to appreciate that value more than if they don't have access to that. And I live in Oklahoma City, but I have been fortunate enough to spend a little bit of time in the River Park system, and it is a wonderful resource for the community. I think what I'm excited about the discussion around zinc and all these people who are here who are really helping us understand there's a big community that cares about protecting this resource. Let's take advantage of those things so that we can help other people understand the value of that resource. It's a modified system. It's not a natural system. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't still have value, and that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do to continue to protect that resource. Part of that means we need everybody to really understand the value of the resource. And that means that, the snakes and the turtles and the dragonflies and maybe even mosquitoes or midges, those have a role in an ecosystem. And if whether you live in the Panhandle of Oklahoma or whether you live in downtown urban Tulsa, around those ecosystems, there's going to be other organisms that you're going to experience, and they're not all bad. There's some wonderful things about learning about those. So I think having this natural area that's going to bring some new ecosystem services is a wonderful opportunity. I think that, we've had some conversations already tonight about how large the Zink Lake watershed is, right? The water that drains into Zink Lake comes from far away and, all the way up in Colorado. And even the watershed in between the Keystone Dam and the Zink Lake Dam is 100,000 acres in size. And so that's a big area to have an impact on. But there's a smaller watershed that really is made up of small tributaries that drain pretty much directly to Zink Lake and that portion of the Arkansas River that is creeks like Crow Creek and Hoosier Creek and Joe Creek. That's a much smaller area. We call it a Huck 12 watershed that's about 20 to 30,000 acres in size. And there are things that we can do in those neighborhoods and along the river corridor itself to reduce the impacts of runoff to that water body. Things like using native plants, reducing and capturing stormwater. The city's already done a great job of maintaining a vegetated area along the stream and talked about, their plans to limit really intensive development. And there are things that we can do in addition to if there does need to be future development to limit impacts from those. Things like building rain gardens or bioretention cells along to collect the runoff from parking areas. Considering whether there are appropriate places to use permeable pavement. Using native plants, planting more trees. Trees in a riparian area have function in both stabilizing stream banks, but they also help shade the river corridor, which is a really important function, especially during the most critical periods for aquatic life, which is generally the summer in this part of the world, because, as I said before, warmer water has less oxygen. And so anything that we can do to keep the water cooler in the summertime, that's going to be better for the aquatic community. Trees in urban areas have been shown to reduce the overall air temperature significantly. And so a greener city is a cooler city. But not just, we can't just protect the river by planting trees, although it's, that's what the Lorax would want. There are things that we can do to modify mowing schedules. We can utilize native plants. We can, because the important functions of in a natural river that there's a vegetative buffer that we call a riparian buffer that's made up of trees and shrubs and grasses that really that filters runoff from upland areas before it reaches the stream, and an effective riparian buffer can reduce as much as 90% of the pollutants entering a water body. We don't necessarily have the same capacity to do that to the Arkansas River because, especially in an urban area, because so much of the drainage to the river has also been modified by storm drains and streets. But there's still important function in maintaining, in places where it makes sense, some areas of taller vegetation that could also be habitat for wildlife or pollinators that I think we all can appreciate the value of those in an urban area. So this riparian buffer that you see on the screen is a stylized idea, but it's really a representation of a recognition that all ecosystems that are diverse have, again, different niches for wildlife, different functions, and so an effective riparian buffer has different types of vegetation that serve different functions. And so the trees provide shade, and the roots of trees provide stabilizing banks. They also then create when a tree dies and falls in the river, that creates aquatic habitat as well. So natural systems have a lot of variability, and so finding opportunities in the river parks system and upstream and downstream of Zink Lake, where it makes sense for us to develop some more naturalized areas. I think that's something that we can do to improve the health of Zink Lake as well. So we aren't, we can't, we're living in an urban area, right? We're not gonna make this a system exactly like it once was. But we can do things both upstream and downstream to improve the quality of the resource that include more naturalized habitat and then things like some green infrastructure to reduce the impacts of the urban runoff before it reaches the river.
We can create practices, and that would happen in our River Parks operating plan, that as they maintain the asset, the practice is, here's how we deal with bank stabilization, or here's how we deal with tree removal, or those kind of things. Those are not, when I say practice, I mean it's not mandated by some sort of law or some sort of adopted defined policy. It's adopted with an internal eye to best practice. So we would rely on our operators, and this is part of our agreement with River Parks and part of, I think, the standard to which they are held. They are not just making sure that the bike trails exist. They are maintaining the entire ecosystem that is River Parks. And I think generally the sentiment in the community is that they do a good job of that. That they maintain Turkey Mountain well, not just as a place to go for a hike, but as an ecosystem. So our practice is really implemented by the River Parks Authority and will be defined, further defined as it relates to the lake in their operational plan. And like I said, that's something that's in the works today. A lot of the things that were discussed just now, I know are part of that consideration. They either already exist or are things that are being considered to be implemented in a plan of practice. The parts of that that are policy, these are things that there's a law for it, or a law is, or like I talked about before, our river design overlay is mandated by law. If you wanted to come build something inside that river design overlay area, you would be subject to that law that says you can't build or design a certain way. What we're already talking about, and what I think will come over the course of the next year, is what is the policy, what is the policy as it relates to how we develop inside that corridor. We're talking about evolving the river design overlay to include things like permeable parking, way stations. There was a discussion just this week about the planting of monarch way stations in the river corridor. What are all of the policies that we can put into place that help ensure that this is a protected system? We do not have a currently adopted full-blown conservation plan for the river corridor or for Zink Lake. I think the next evolution of our work is to think about what are our objectives here. We know what they are. It's a recreational amenity. It's a kind of a city asset for that type of thing, just like Turkey Mountain. I kind of keep comparing it to Turkey Mountain. Turkey Mountain is this wonderful asset that we utilize here that helps people appreciate nature, it helps people be active and do all those things. It's an asset to the city. We see that Zink Lake as the same kind of thing. It's just the water one. We want people being active and recreating and enjoying themselves here. It should enhance quality of life. Both of them represent a responsibility to all of us. So as a community, we've decided to invest in that responsibility. That means as a community, we have an obligation to take care of it. And so how we decide to take care of that Zink Lake amenity is the work that we're so excited to be having conversations with organizations like yours tonight, and really represents kind of the next bit of our work here in developing practices but also developing policies. Both of those things will inform how we take care of this thing moving forward.
And so, as you engage with your Menti app, one of those questions may be, if you're interested in codifying some of those practices, right? And then understanding those policies, we want to understand that what's the process in doing that, right? So we go to our agency map and we'll understand who are the agencies involved with codifying those practices. So just a thought for our next section about.
Well, I can save you the question and be faster. The city of Tulsa doesn't do anything like that without a defined process of public engagement. So the part of it that are policy that come from the city will be an update to an already adopted document that includes these new policies. I would expect to see that coming from your city council in the months to come. The part of it that has to do with River Park's practices is not necessarily an open public come and tell us your ideas thing, but I can assure you that that will not happen without that practice. River Parks and the city will be working through that together with a whole lot more of this, and with a lot of individual stakeholder discussions about how to implement best practice. We also have partners at state agencies and otherwise that can bring that information to the table for us.
There is collaboration. Is upstream. I'm aware of efforts upstream of Keystone Lake, actually in the city, around the city of Wichita, to really work on limiting the impact of runoff to the Arkansas River. Working with farmers to provide incentives for them to adopt more sustainable conservation practices and more sustainable farming practices that will reduce runoff of sediment and other pollutants to the river. And they've been working on that for a number of years. In the city, even as the city of Tulsa has done for in partnership to protect their water supply in the Chief-Valvenaugh Lakes, they invested in providing incentives to agricultural producers upstream of Wichita to protect that resource. So there are other conservation programs, there are conservation districts that work with agricultural producers upstream of Keystone Lake to help them learn new methods to reduce the impact of their operations. And this year is a record year for resources to help those producers consider practices that reduce climate impacts from agricultural practices that both focus on adoption of conservation practices that avoid emissions, but also attempt to sequester carbon in soil. So there are more and more, we're living in an unprecedented era of opportunity for partnerships to bring resources at the table to help people adopt new methods of conservation. And one thing that is available to communities to work on pollution prevention is a program in partnership with the Oklahoma Water Resources Board for a state revolving fund loan. That typically those loans are used to help communities improve their water and wastewater treatment processes. But the Water Resources Board is making also loans to communities, some of which are principal forgiveness loans, which means it's more like a grant, to also work on non-point source pollution reduction projects. And I think it would be really interesting if this community could come together to consider whether there could be some demonstration work, some pilot projects that we could test out in partnership with the city of Tulsa along the River Parks area to demonstrate some of those practices. Because the city really only has direct effect and control over what happens in the river park system. But as we've heard, right, there's a lot of private land that drains into Zink Lake and the river upstream and downstream. And so some of doing work to limit the impacts of lawn of you know, people who are as Eric mentioned, um, you know, putting things down the drain or letting their trash blow into the river or over fertilizing their lawns. Those are things that really rely on education to help people better understand the impacts of how the things that they do day in and day out impact the ecosystem around them. And one really great tool for education is developing some demonstration sites so people learn how they better manage their lawn or better control rather than letting the rain gutter from your house drain immediately to the street. You could feed that into a rain garden in your yard that would then reduce the runoff of pollutants that goes into your nearby stream. So I think there are some opportunities for partnerships to develop some demonstration projects that could be used to help educate people because it's going to take the whole community to really protect the resource, not just the city.
Thank you for those. And I would say we have programs at the Sustainability Alliance that can, you can learn a little bit more about those sort of, first steps to, what do I do with my lawn? Maybe you don't have a lawn, maybe you do something else there. So, get connected with us about some of those basics to improve what's happening here in Tulsa.